Coming up on the Sports Reporters.
Tons of cocaine coming through Southern California and then branching off up north to Canada, other points in the U.S. How does that even happen? I didn't know.
Schaap, I mean, these court documents are fascinating because we're talking, to Pierre's point, 300, 400 kilos of cocaine in boxes and multiple boxes that were being so much cocaine that the semi truck driver says, we're not going to be able to fit all of this into the semi.
Welcome to the Sports Reporters. Our subject today, the Canadian Olympic snowboarder who is now accused of murder and drug trafficking. He's also now in U.S. custody. Ryan Wedding. 24 years ago, he was competing at the Salt Lake Winter Games. Now he's being mentioned in the same breath as Pablo Escobar and El Chapo. This is what the FBI said about him when he was put on the top 10 most wanted list last year. At present, Wedding is wanted for allegedly running a transnational drug trafficking network that routinely shipped hundreds of kilos of cocaine from Colombia through Mexico and Southern California to Canada and other locations in the U.S., and for orchestrating multiple murders and an attempted murder in furtherance of these drug crimes. Wedding went from shredding powder on the slopes at the Olympics to distributing powder cocaine on the streets of U.S. cities and in his native Canada. That's what the assistant director of the FBI's Los Angeles field office said. He went on to say the alleged murders of his competitors make Wedding a very dangerous man, and his addition to the list of 10 most wanted fugitives, coupled with a major reward offered by the State Department, will make the public our partners so that we can catch up with him before he puts anyone else in danger. For more, we're joined now by Alyssa Roenigk and Tisha Thompson of ESPN, who've been tracking this story for the last year, and by Pierre, who is the Chief Justice Correspondent at ABC News. So, guys, an extraordinary story on so many levels. Pierre, let's start with you. Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, compared Ryan Wedding to El Chapo and Pablo Escobar. Based on these allegations, is that hyperbole or does it fit?
Well, great to be with you. And what I will say is that he is one of the more colorful and interesting alleged drug kingpins that I've ever had covered. 6'3", 240 pounds, known as the Giant, known as the Boss, also known allegedly as the public enemy. And what the federal authorities are claiming is that he was the biggest supplier, they allege, of drugs into Canada, that his transshipment corridor went from Mexico into Southern California, then to Canada and different parts of the United States. And they used the word billions, that the enterprise raked in billions of dollars. And in order to back that up, they've displayed some evidence in court, and in court filings suggested that, for example, that he had 62 motorcycles valued at $40 million, that he was a man of great means. And also, as you mentioned, they suggested he was a person that was capable of ordering murders, multiple murders. That is what the government alleges.
Tisha?
I mean, he is considered to be the biggest supplier of cocaine in Canada. And as Pierre said, $1 billion enterprise. As we read through these court records, there are truck shipments that have so much cocaine in them, they can't even fit all the cocaine that they want to transport through Los Angeles. And he's been wanted for a very, very long time, more than a decade. The Canadians caught him in an undercover investigation. This is all according to court records that Alyssa and I have been reading through, and this comes from the Canadian government. They did this big sting operation, and they caught him on camera talking about how he wanted to use ships to transport cocaine through the Caribbean and then up through Newfoundland in Canada, and then use semi-trucks to move it into Toronto. And they were able to apprehend every person that was connected to that investigation except Ryan Wedding. So he's been at large for a decade. And as you go through these court records, it becomes very apparent that he moved his way up from being a courier, where he was caught in 2008. He was caught in 2008 moving 24 kilos in Los Angeles, and he went to prison for that for a short period of time here in the United States. And as soon as he got out, he gets caught doing this operation up in Canada on camera, but they don't actually catch him. And from there, he really builds out this empire, according to federal prosecutors, and people get killed along the way.
So listen, I covered those games in 2002 in Salt Lake City. You cover winter sports extensively for ESPN. Is Ryan Wedding somebody that fans of snowboarding and snow sports know of? Was he a big deal in the community?
25 years ago, I would have answered this question differently. 25 years ago, he was a promising young snowboarder in the discipline, as you see there, of parallel giant slalom, which is a head-to-head snowboard race, high-speed race through gates. It's a much more popular discipline in Europe and Asia, where the World Cup races are still held. Here in the United States, we haven't held a race in more than a decade. It's not an event. If you remember back in 2002, this is before Slopestyle, Big Air, and some of the more popular events had been added. So, back then he was a really promising young athlete. He, according to media reports, he'd been skiing and snowboarding since before he could walk. His grandparents owned a small ski hill outside of Thunder Bay, Ontario, where he is from. His uncle was a coach on the women's alpine team, and his dad skied in college. And at 12, he moved to Vancouver when his family moved for his father's job. And he switched to snowboarding, and he was a fast study. By 15, he was on the national team. And by 20, he was racing in the Olympics. But as you know, after those 2002 Olympics, he left the sport. And so I don't think we really know, he was just coming on to the international scene. I don't think we really know what kind of potential Ryan Wedding had as an athlete.
So you said he was a quick study. He won his first race in this discipline. He gets the Olympics 20 years ago, when he's 24. He's 44 now, or I'm sorry, 24 years ago when he was 20 in the 2002 yes. games. He's 44 now. So what do we know about what happened to his career after those games, Alyssa?
We don't know a lot, honestly. Those Olympics were his debut. They did not go well. He didn't make it out of the first round. He finished 24th place, and he stopped competing shortly after the 2002 games. So like I said, we really don't know. He was just coming on to the international scene in a sport that really is about longevity. If you look at the teams that the United States still brings a man and a woman each year, the Canadian team still fields a full team. There's a lot of longevity in that sport, and he was really, really just getting started.
Canadian media has found stories that did profiles of him. And there's stories that say he was a bouncer at a club after the Olympics. And it was only just 4 years or so after that he is named in a search warrant in British Columbia for being part of an alleged marijuana farm operation. He wasn't ever charged with anything, and he disappears at that point. He has connections to British Columbia, to Alberta, to Montreal, and especially in Toronto, which is where he pops up in that Canadian drug bust.
Well, and what I was going to add is that this period from 2002 to 2008, so 6 years later after appearing in the Winter Olympics at Salt Lake City, he is charged in connection with alleged drug trafficking in California. And that period of time, that 6-year period, for those who are writing the book, who want to know more about him, I think that's a critical period. What happened? What went on in his life that would allegedly make him turn into this person that was interested in selling drugs? And interestingly, when you look at the background, he's convicted of that crime in 2011, and 2010,
right?
And he's released in 2011, which is a relatively short period of time. And it's after that point that the Canadian authorities charge him in connection with alleged trafficking, and then the federal government and the Canadians allege that there's a series of violent events they allege that are connected to him. Number one, a family in Ontario, a husband, wife are killed. The daughter is injured. They think it's a bizarre case of mistaken identity. They're renting property, and the people allegedly were there to try to kill someone associated with the drug conspiracy, but these people were innocent. And then they talk about various other people that were killed, at least 2 other people killed, allegedly tied to the drug conspiracy. It's later in the late 2024, 2025 that these new charges start to unfold, where the federal government is alleging that he's this grand figure tied to the Sinaloa cartel. There's a $10 million reward. Then it's up to $15 million of reward. And you can see the intensity increase after a point at which they allege that there's a federal witness that is being developed. And they allege that Wedding, after getting information that if this witness, quote, went away to something or something to that effect, if that person were out of the picture, that the charges against him might disappear. The witness is killed in Colombia, murdered in a restaurant, shot 5 times in the head. So it's at that point, if you look at the narrative presented by federal authorities, that really the efforts intensified to make him a national, international figure, wanted figure that needs to be arrested.
So we've got these charges now. The charges now, right? We're talking about the drug trafficking. We're talking about homicide. We're talking about attempted homicide. We're talking about running a criminal enterprise. When we're talking again about these kinds of allegations and a $15 million reward, we're not talking about a foot soldier in some drug trafficking operation. They're describing him as the kingpin. It's, in terms of this story and the unlikelihood of some Olympic athlete ending up with these kinds of allegations against him, how do you wrap your head around it, Alyssa?
I'm not sure that we have yet, to be honest with you. I mean, I think to Pierre's point, the most intriguing time period in his life is that period between the 2002 Olympics and when he was arrested, especially between 2002 and 2008. We reached out to, from the beginning of this manhunt for him a year and a half ago, Tisha and I reached out to many athletes on the Canadian team, former teammates, former coaches, people who were associated with the program, as well as athletes and support staff.
I'm assuming
from
there
around
might
the
have
world.
been a reluctance to talk about him.
And no one was willing to speak to us on the record. But what we gleaned from those conversations, as well as Tisha was saying, multiple media reports from the time, he was known as an aggressive guy, a tough guy. Like Pierre said, he's 6'3". Even back then, he was a formidable man. He had a reputation as a racer, as being, as taking the most aggressive line, as being on the edge. In a sport like PGS, that is, as that's the difference between winning a race and just as likely, you're going to crash out. And Wedding had a reputation for both. And, you have to wonder how much of that personality he took off the snow with him as well.
Yeah. So, we were talking about the conviction in 2010 from the crime that was committed in 2008 and just spending a year in prison. How does that happen? Is that, you mentioned that it was a short time to be incarcerated for that kind of a charge, Pierre, but how unusual is that? I mean, it was a lot of cocaine. It clearly was a trafficking situation. It wasn't a personal use or anything like that. It was kilos and kilos, right? So what do we know about how he got out so quickly? Do we know anything at this point?
There's not a lot of detail, but if you look back at it, it's not that unusual sometimes, depending on the charge, whether you can get some time off for good behavior. Also, you have to realize that he was sentenced to 48 months in jail. And what I don't know yet is of the time from 2008 until the time that he actually was convicted and also sentenced to prison, how much of that time was he actually incarcerated? And, some of it could have been based on time already spent incarcerated. So we're still digging into those kinds of details because, as you say, Jeremy, the story is just so unique and interesting. Can anyone else think of a Olympic level athlete who is now accused of being one of the biggest drug traffickers who's been arrested in recent memory? It just does not happen. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of trying to understand this man. And if these allegations are true, and again, we should remind people, innocent until proven guilty, that if these allegations are true, how does one, infiltrate, inculcate themselves, or I should use a better word, how does one endear themselves or build enough trust within a cartel of these various organizations to amass this kind of wealth, if it's true, and this kind of power? I don't know if you've seen that photograph of the 62 motorcycles.
Yeah.
That
All those Ducatis.
Right.
And the Mercedes.
Right.
And not just any Mercedes, if I may say.
No, not any
$13
Mercedes.
million, very, very rare Mercedes.
Right.
And not just any Ducatis as well.
And so when you think about that's the federal government in making the case of trying to prove to people, they're not before a jury yet, but that's part of when they put out these releases and they sort of lay out the essence of the case. Those are signposts, if you will, to the American people and to the broader audience. This was a person who had these kinds of means. The average person, the lower level drug dealer, they're not going to have those kind of means. So they're trying to establish in the minds of the public that this truly was a person of vast wealth.
And I also think it's important to point out that they are saying that, to Pierre's point, Ryan Wedding is not someone who's working in a certain zone. That they, in the court documents, they are accusing him of orchestrating the movement of the cocaine from where it's being cooked in Colombia. One of the defendants is the actual chef, I mean, to use for lack of a better way of describing him, who's actually cooking the cocaine. He's accused of cooking the cocaine. And then the cocaine would move through Mexico or the Caribbean. It would go to these safe houses in Los Angeles. And this informant that they were able to recruit, and the FBI was able to recruit in 2023, was intercepting and aiding the transport of the cocaine from the safe houses to semi-trucks that had been sent from Canada that were then supposed to go over the border. And what Wedding and some of his higher ups didn't know was that this informant was sending these messages or allowing the American government to see these messages, and they were watching everything go down. And so they were able to apprehend some of the couriers, and then they later rounded up everybody else. And, some of those guys are already in prison. That's how long it took from when they made the arrest, the initial arrest with this informant, to how long it to finally catch Ryan Wedding himself. And part of the net that closed in around Wedding was when they apprehended his number two, who they allege is the guy who was his second in command. His name is Andrew Clark. And when they were able to apprehend him in March of last year, they got their hands on his phone. And his phone had information. This is all according to court records. They don't identify the second in command by name, but you can piece together based on the previous indictment, who's who. You can piece all this stuff together. And so the second in command, his phone had information, and then he gave some information to the FBI that helped them figure out how this informant was murdered in Colombia.
And I would say, just to help the viewers watching understand what we're talking about in terms of the scale. The scale is that these people were using tractor trailers and other large kinds of vehicles to move cocaine by the ton. So this is what
tons of cocaine coming through Southern California and then branching off up north to Canada, other points in the U.S. How does that even happen? I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, these court documents are fascinating because we're talking, to Pierre's point, 300, 400 kilos of cocaine in boxes, and multiple boxes that were being so much cocaine that the semi truck driver says, we're not going to be able to fit all of this into the semi. And they had been kept in homes throughout the Los Angeles area. I mean, off the top of my head, I remember Riverside and communities all throughout LA. These homes were in different locations. There were different couriers that took the cocaine to those homes. And then a different courier would pick them up, transport them to a guy they had never met. And they had this very complicated system of figuring out who's legit and who's not legit. And the FBI was able to intercept all of this messaging to transport through this complex network using this informant. And Ryan Wedding wanted him found. I mean, the second indictment that came out a couple months ago lays out in great detail the amount of effort that, and it's all of this again is alleged by prosecutors. To Pierre's point, innocent until proven guilty. But these documents lay out how Wedding sent out more than a dozen people to try to track down this informant. He knew who he was fairly quickly, even though he wasn't identified by name in the court documents, they figured it out. And they went out and they began searching. And it is a Hollywood cast of characters. I mean, it is just stunning how so much of this sounds like it can't possibly be true because it sounds like it's from a Hollywood script. There is a former junior hockey player who reaches out through his network in Alberta to a crime blogger who's posting the picture of the guy that they are searching for and saying, we're looking for him. And, you know, this guy ratted out Ryan Wedding's organization. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he sends out. And the manhunt is on. They go to Saudi Arabia. They go down to Colombia. They get a commercial sex working network to have a woman who's based out of Orlando lure their guy to Colombia and Medellin to this restaurant. And the way they were able to do that is they allegedly put tracking software on his phone after a reggaeton artist up in Canada was paid somewhere between 500 and 1,000 Canadian dollars for his phone number. I mean, it just goes on.
And
on.
He was assassinated at that restaurant.
He was assassinated. He sits down at this restaurant and a guy appears, walks into the restaurant, shoots him 5 times through the head, flees. And then a guy comes up and takes a picture of the body. And then he flees, and they are still looking for those 5 guys.
And post the picture.
And that's the key. I mean, the court documents aren't very, like, you got to the court documents say there was a photograph taken, and then this crime blogger has a photograph showing the restaurant and the bottom half of the body, and it says, you know, headshot. He's been taken out, and this is how we know who the witness's name is it was put on this crime blogging website. So they wanted to send, and this is what the prosecutors say, Ryan Wedding wanted to send the message that if you cross him, he will find you and he will take you out. And these other folks that he had targeted, one of the guys in Niagara Falls, you know, is accused of having stolen 300 kilos. I'm sorry, not the Niagara Falls guy. I apologize. The guy that was the intended target of the family who was was taken out in their own home. He was accused of stealing 300 kilos from Wedding's organization.
Outside of Toronto.
Outside of Toronto. Thank you.
One thing I was going to add to help, again, folks at home watching is this. Let's move Ryan Wedding and the allegations against him over to the side for a second. I in my career have had an opportunity to go down to the border to see efforts to confiscate drugs as they come into the country. And it's fascinating. They have x-ray machines, they have all these different kind of machines, because literally the flow of drugs into this country to match the apparent appetite of people who want to do cocaine, marijuana, and all these other different drugs is incredible to see and to understand. And they have these secret locations in various parts of the country where they store all the different drugs that they've recovered. And to walk through these facilities that are bigger than your average Walmart, and to literally see ton after ton after ton after ton, it helps you understand that the cartels that move drugs across this planet are literally multi-billion-dollar operations in the same way that, you know, people selling cars. I mean, it's incredible to understand. So that, I think, will help people get a sense of the scale of what we're talking about and how Ryan Wedding may or may not fit into what we actually see taking place.
Yeah, and I think it's important, right, to come back to the human toll. And it's such a fantastical story, and you can see it already becoming a made-for-TV movie or series, and true crime and all that. Somebody's going to do a 15-part podcast about it. But we're talking about murders. We're talking about alleged murders, I should say. People were definitely murdered. The allegations against Ryan Wedding. We're talking about what the police say, people who were murdered in cases of mistaken identity, essentially innocent bystanders, worst kinds of crimes you can imagine. In addition to the crimes of supplying these drugs, these illegal drugs, and the effect that they had on so many lives as well. And the people up and down the supply chain, right? The violence that is inherent in some kind of an operation like this. So, it's just important, right? We got to keep that in mind. And it's not just, crazy snowboarder is alleged to have done this, or, crazy story about alleged snowboarder.
The story of what happened in the mistaken identity is just stunning, because it was a couple who were visiting their grown children who were living in Canada. They had come overseas to see their grown children, and they were staying in this rental house. And gunmen, the prosecutors call it a Canadian assassin crew. I mean, they're calling these folks assassins. They came bursting through the house. They gunned down the father. They gunned down the mother. And then the daughter, the adult daughter, who's in her 20s at the time, she gets gunned down, but survives. She has gun injuries, weapon injuries, all the way from her throat, through her chest, down her stomach, through her legs. They just went up and down and got her. And she somehow survived. And she tells this tale after the murders first happened, and they're still trying to, we don't know that Ryan Wedding's organization might be connected to this at this point, but the local Canadian news orgs out there were reporting that she said weird things were happening, that people were visiting the house. And, when you put the pieces together, it's apparent that Ryan Wedding's organization thought that this guy that they thought, they think stole 300 kilos from them was in that house, or this was his family. And there are
the allegations. Yes.
Yeah, there are examples in the court records where Wedding is threatening to kill the families of people who owe him, small amounts of methamphetamine. And I say small amounts because this is all big amounts. This is all drug trafficking, but we're not talking hundreds of kilos. Sometimes it's small amounts, and he wants his money, and he's threatening to kill, again, allegedly threatening to kill the mother of a guy who owes him for a drug trade that they made.
Yeah. So Alyssa, we got the I'm sorry, go ahead, Pierre.
No, I was just going to say that, at the end of the day, we will see if these court documents will shine in court, and whether a jury will buy it, and also we'll see whether what kind of defense is mounted on behalf of Mr. Wedding. These cases are elaborate. The amount of resources that go into making these kind of arrests are stunning in themselves. But again, in these cases, you really never know until you get these cases before a jury how these things will play out.
A really interesting example of that is the very well-known criminal defense attorney in the Toronto area who is now being accused of working for the Wedding organization, and is the one, according to federal prosecutors, who told Wedding and his second command that if they eliminated the federal witness, that the case would be dismissed. That attorney has been going through the extradition process in Canada, and he was released on bail. And as part of the argument about whether this man should be released or not, it was the Canadian prosecutors who said, if you let him out, he could get gunned down, like he might die. So that's the level of violence that we're talking about, that, we already have a witness that was taken out, according to fellow prosecutors. And there's a lot of fear. I mean, to Alyssa's point, people people who have nothing to do with this operation don't even want to have their name connected to him in any shape or form, having been a former athlete who happened to be on the same team with him. That's the level of paranoia about this guy.
Yeah. So Alyssa, at the Olympics, the way it works, of course, a lot of people covering sports, they don't typically cover. The Canadian snowboarding team is going to be there, the American snowboarding team, although Ryan Wedding's a Canadian, competed for Canada and all that. The snowboarding community, which is close-knit anyway, and kind of, in my experience covering them, they kind of look at things differently than a lot of other competitive athletes. It's a lot about this, this community and how close-knit they are. How are they going to respond to all the questions they're inevitably going to get about some guy they don't even know?
Yeah, when this story first broke a year and a half ago, and we were reaching out to athletes, their response, most of the athletes competing, a lot of them aren't old enough to have even been born when he was competing, right? So you have to remember that they don't have a personal relationship with him. However, their reaction was largely mirroring the larger community's reaction, surprise and shock and questions about how this could have happened. Now that he's in custody, I think that the snowboarding community just hopes this is not the only story in Milan Cortina, that all of the questions are not about Ryan Wedding. When you all were talking about the 2010 case, if you remember, that was happening in the lead up to the Vancouver Olympics, the Olympics that were taking place in his backyard. And if you read through those court documents and the media reports of the time and the transcripts, his defense leaned very heavily into his Olympic career. He seemed very, remorseful about what he'd done. They talked about how he dreamed of being an Olympian again in 2010, even though there's no evidence that he had even competed in the years since 2002. Yesterday, when his attorney appeared outside of the courthouse, he mentioned his Olympic career multiple times. I think that's something that, once again, they're going to lean into the fact that he was this Olympian. And so I think that's, we're bound to see more journalists at the PGS race on February 8th than we typically would. As you know, it's not covered with the same sort of energy here in the United States as events like halfpipe and slopestyle and big air. But I imagine it will be. There will be a larger media presence. And in, talking to the athletes I've talked to and the folks in the snowboard community since his arrest on Friday, the overall feeling was just that I hope this isn't the only question I get, and that the only attention isn't about Ryan Wedding, and also it's about, the race that's happening in Lavinia.
And Schaap, I just want to bring it up. When we were, looking at all the different photos that were being released by the American government, along with the fancy motorcycles and the really super expensive car, there was a photograph that was taken from inside, or was evidence that was taken from inside one of the homes that they thought might be connected to Wedding in Mexico. So down in Mexico, they found 2 medals, and Alyssa was the one looking at it very carefully. A lot of people are calling it Olympic medals, and I want to give Alyssa a shout out. She was like, no, he came in 24th. Those are not Olympic medals. And they were what, Alyssa? They're Canadian
National Championship medals.
So he
and
had
it is essentially a way to connect. I think that helped them to connect what they found to Wedding, but it is, to Tisha's point, very interesting that those medals were with him.
He had those medals with him.
Pierre Thomas from ABC News, Tisha Thompson, and Alyssa Roenigk from ESPN. Thank you all for getting us up to speed on the remarkable story of Ryan Wedding.
Pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks, Jeremy.